The rewriting of history has begun. With a return to the culture wars, bitter fighting over game censorship feels like ancient history. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. We are still fighting that battle. So why would we claim that the culture war over censorship is ancient history? Well, because this article is going to reframe and redefine it, as the left is so good at doing, as not something currently ongoing, a conflict that the left has categorically lost, but as something that has already happened. Because remember, one of the core strategies of progressivism is to simply say, it didn't happen. And if it did happen, we certainly weren't the bad guys. And if we were the bad guys, well, it was probably a good thing. Where we are now. But conservatives have never considered the matter settled, and attacks on sexual or LGBTQ-themed games are the opening move of a broader re-litigation. I pointed this out when the collective shout thing started becoming a main issue, when I saw a lot of left-wing commentators claiming that a bunch of Australian self-declared and defined feminists were actually a conservative censorship movement. And I warned then that the left would try to now pivot to claim that it was the conservatives who were pro-censorship all along. That narrative has now begun to hit the mainstream, so we're going to have a look at this article here today, as it is both a wonderful warning of the new progressive tactic and also an example of how even when rewriting history, the progressives can't help but trip over their own history. It is almost a quarter century since Grand Theft Auto 3 launched, in the process effectively heralding the beginning of a decade in which video games were thrust into the heart of a bitterly fought culture war. So now we are defining the culture wars as something that happened in 2001. About a decade or so after the actual beginnings of it. For those too young to remember that era clearly, it's hard to explain just how serious and concerted efforts to censor, ban, or otherwise regulate the content of video games were. Socially conservative politicians, commentators, and opportunists on both sides of the Atlantic rushed to make video games a scapegoat for youth violence. Not really, though. See, here's the thing. Unlike what he's saying here, this wasn't a new strategy, it was the same type of attack that had in previous decades targeted music genres like rap, metal, etc. It wasn't. Now he's referring to this bit is the satanic panic, right? But Grand Theft Auto 3 and the supposed conservative effort was largely done by, well, single lunatic individuals, as he's referring to Jack Thompson, of course, a rather infamous individual that did indeed try to allege that Grand Theft Auto was responsible for an increase in youth violence. But here's the thing. Jack Thompson, who'd previously worked with Democrats incidentally, wasn't a movement, he wasn't an organization, he wasn't a concerted effort, in fact, he was a laughing stock. Nobody took him seriously. And the handful of supposed studies that came out alleging a link between violence and video games were all roundly debunked and laughed at. This had nothing to stand upon. It was literally just a couple of individual lunatics, that was all, who achieved nothing. Largely the same as the satanic panic, which I mentioned in my Porners Our Canary Down the Coal Mine video. Whilst it was a cultural movement to a degree, it did virtually nothing. The handful of laws that it did manage to enact were usually on the state level in the US, and rarely, if ever, actually led to anything because the satanic panic, much like modern-day leftism, was based largely on nonsense. GTA 3, however, was a turning point. Attacks on video games have largely been occasional potshots when there wasn't much else in the news. Right-wing papers could reliably knock up some pearl-clutching about a video game when there wasn't much else to fill space with, and that is a far more honest representation of events than what he'd alleged just paragraphs ago. Occasional efforts at gaining attention, basically. Now they have become the absolute core issue for conservative culture warriors. Ah yes, pro-censorship is a core issue for conservatives in this day and age. Are you mad? And this is where the conflation with Collective Shout, of course, comes in. Collective Shout with campaign manager Caitlin Roper, the co-founder of the Feminist Academy of Technology and Ethics, a writer for The Guardian and Huffington Post, well-known right-wing conservative papers, of course. No, utter and complete nonsense. GTA 3's commercial success piggybacking on the broader success of PlayStation and turning games into a mainstream medium in that era was part of the reason for that. The other part of the reason was that GTA 3 included not just a lot of violence, but also allusions to sex and prostitution. Then we move on to the hot coffee incident to try and move on from GTA 3, because GTA 3 is used here solely to put the whole conservative culture war as far back as possible in 2001. But before we move on from that, because whilst I'm of course entirely sure that protection of prostitutes is a core conservative value, I'd like to investigate this a little bit further. Grand Theft Auto 3 was of course banned in one country, Australia. Now, why was that, I wonder? Why was it banned in Australia? And especially, why was it banned under legislation introduced by the Labour government? This is where I say that even when the progressives attempt to rewrite history, they keep stumbling over their own censorship. As yes indeed, the reason why GTA 3 was censored on Australia was because it included sexual violence. That was the attack on prostitutes in the game. Now again, protection of prostitutes is not exactly a core conservative value, but it's certainly something that the progressives like to do quite a bit. And the legislation that would introduce this law was largely spearheaded by Michael Duffy, the Attorney General of Australia under Labour. It began with the Censorship Procedure Report number 55 that tried to formulate an easier way for general classification of material to be censored, to make it easier to censor things. Again, started by Labour. That led to the Parliament of the Commonwealth of Australia, House of Representatives, Classification of Publications, Film and Computer Games Bill of 1994, which finally resulted in the Classification of Publications, Films and Computer Games Act of 1995, which was the one who introduced their ratings system, which did not include a rating system that would allow GTA 3 to be sold in their country, as it forbid things like sexual violence. Again, all of this was introduced by a Labour government. This was not a conservative effort, although I will point out the Conservatives didn't make a concerted effort to stop it either, but the reason why GTA 3 was banned in Australia and censored was because of Labour. Progressivism, not conservatism. And then the hot coffee incident. It's no accident that arguably the biggest blow these culture warriors were able to strike against the GTA series was the hot coffee incident, in which it transpired that code and assets for a minigame in which the protagonist had sex with his girlfriend had been left on the disc for GTA San Andreas, although it wasn't accessible to players without using mods. In a game which you could gleefully murder people by the hundreds, it was an inaccessible animation of some fully clothed humping that got the game re-rated adults only by the ESRB and a drugstore warning from the FTC. Ultimately, this is an argument that the Conservatives lost. So, let's talk about the hot coffee incident, shall we? Now, if you don't remember, San Andreas came out, was a big success, but then it was revealed that there was content on disc including sexual acts. This was because initially, the intent had been to include a lot more sexual things in the game, and these files were then later rediscovered by people modifying the game. These were already on the disc. It wasn't removed, it wasn't modded in, it was on the disc of San Andreas. Now, the thing here isn't that the conservatives were like, oh my god, we really do hate the sexy smexy, although that was certainly a part of it on a moral basis. The reason why the FTC moved against this wasn't because of morals or ethics, it was because San Andreas had porn on it, and it had been given the incorrect rating. The reason why they cut the hot coffee content was to get a lower rating. And so when they received that rating, and it was revealed that the content which didn't match the rating was on the disc, content that would have classified it adults only, obviously the FTC would go, no, you lied to us, you fucking bitches. This is entirely fine and understandable. They lied to the ratings board and they got punished for it. There's nothing wrong with this. This isn't censorship. This is literally, you lied on the official documents, we sold the game based on your documents, and then we figured out that there was porn in the game. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. So these then are the strongest examples of conservative censorship. A law passed by a Labour government and an entirely 1000% fine reaction by the FCC over a ratings problem. Gamers were repeatedly confirmed to be protective of speech in the United States. That isn't speech, by the way. I am the first to say that porn should be speech. I am fine with having hentai everywhere and have it be protected, but lying to the ratings board isn't free speech. And came to be generally accepted as a creative medium deserving of free expression in most other Western jurisdictions. Now, by the way, notice as well, the progressives are going to try and claim gaming. Our anti-censorship achievements, they will now attempt to define as progressive. The argument that violent games were responsible for violent crime amongst young people, meanwhile, was debunked over and over again. Yes, most probably treat this whole era as a historical curiosity, a growing pain for the medium similar to the backlash experienced by many other types of media in the past. That is correct, that is what it was. But with cultural conservatism now back in the ascendancy in many countries, there are plenty of groups on that side who absolutely have not forgotten how they lost the battle over video games and are aching to relitigate it from their newfound position of socio-cultural power, using smarter and sharper approaches they've been honing for decades. Make no mistake, what you can see sliding into medium's most vulnerable fault lines right now is the thin end of a very thick wedge. Now, I do agree, but it's not a conservative wedge here, because all of this is of course referring to payment processor. As they talk about here later on, LGBTQ themes being censored and payment processors in the United States, framework to ban pornographic content and expand the definition of pornography to include anything related to the lives and existence of minority groups they dislike. This is where we come to the collective shout stretch. So again, collective shout has by the left been defined as a conservative movement, largely because of their very loose association with an actual conservative movement. Here's the thing, anti-porn censorship is a left and a right-wing issue, because both wish to censor pornography. The left wishes to censor it on the basis of women's empowerment. The conservatives wish to censor it because it is degenerate. They come at it from two different sides, but the goal is much the same. However, we like to think that it's only our opposition who is doing wrong, don't we? Now, in the case of the left, they are now focusing on the LGBTQ tags, etc. Because yes, indeed, a bunch of the games being censored did have these tags in them, usually because, well, the fetishes that these people like to explore tend to be rather strident, shall we say. See, if we're going to move in against deviant fetishes, which we saw with the collective shout nonsense, which we now see with payment processors, etc., you are going to be striking out at the more extremist fetishes first, like, oh, I don't know, puppy play, perhaps? Sexually erotic bondage, fetish, gear-related things, BDSM, you know, the usual things you see in your average pride parade. Yeah, you're hitting your own with friendly fire here, because of course, we've talked about previously the split between the feminist movement and the progressivist movement. The feminists are, well, conservative in the extent that they wish to keep the definition of woman to be adult human female, which has now been defined as a conservative position by the ever-increasing crazy nature of the progressives. They don't want to have your deviancy on display. And they have also figured out that, yes indeed, they've practiced their tactics of cancel culture censorship on the left for decades now. Which is why when they approach payment processors, who are by no stretch of the imagination conservative, they can utilize the language of the left to get their way. Especially as the payment processors themselves are very, 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 very much so on the side of censorship in this case, as they want to get rid of anything and everything that appears to be a brand risk to them, as they have now arrived at a position where they are so ensconced, so solidly protected against virtually any backlash that they can enforce whatever standards of morals they choose. And there's the thing. If they were simply just worried about a backlash, they wouldn't move against anything. They would simply exist as payment processors, continuing to sit on their incredibly profitable niche and de facto monopoly over the banking and payment processing market. But then you add in the moral aspect of it, with all of these companies being filled with HR people and progressive-leaning individuals who have a problem with pornography. Those are the people that Collective Shout contacted. That is why Collective Shout, with less than 1,000 phone calls, managed to get a massive games taken off Steam, whereas the actual conservatives, quote-unquote, the anti-censorship people today, didn't achieve a single goddamn fucking thing with weeks of constant phone activism against Visa and MasterCard. It is because they do not have the correct politics. It is that simple. If one group that defines itself as feminist achieves something with 1,000 phone calls, that another group that defines itself as conservative cannot with 100,000, the reason is obvious. But again, the point of things like this isn't to accurately represent reality. It is to begin to redefine it yet again, to rewrite it, to try and make the villains of the last 20 years not the ones actually pushing for, and crucially and differently from people like Jack Thompson, succeeding in introducing ever more extensive and far-reaching censorship regulations, just kind of fade into the background. Forget the last 24 years, what about this thing? You're going to be seeing a lot more of this from here on out, I'll promise you that. And when you do, remember this video. Because there's going to need to be pushback against this. And it's going to need to be nice and loud. If they get away with it, well, they'll simply take credit for everything you did. They will become the gamers. Yet again. Gamers aren't dead. Gamers do have to be your audience. Progressives, 2025. Next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching. Do hope to see you all again soon. Well then, have a good day.